Hey, it's Bryant. It has been quite a while since I made a video, 2.5 weeks to be exact. Ask any college administrator what their August is like, and that will be your answer right there. So just an incredibly busy time, but I'm really excited to make lots and lots of videos on James or other authors or anything else that's going on. I was thinking back to my visit to my folks during Christmas back in December, and I was looking at my dad's shelves, and I came across this enormous anthology called The Introduction to Modern English and American Literature, edited by Somerset Maugham. And there's an introduction in this book that is 26 pages, small font. And it's fascinating. He's talking about what he includes, how he came to those decisions, mostly short fiction, some poetry. He goes through the writers, talks about the certain, works that he's going to discuss. And of course, there's always these jibs and jabs that he throws. He had a reputation for being a little hostile to other writers. It seems like many writers are kind of petty where competition is concerned, so to speak. But Mom was kind of at another level. And I remember I didn't want to take this big book with me back to where I live across state lines. So what I did is I took my iPad and I took as many photos of the introduction that I could, because at the very end of the introduction there is a 5-paragraph special section devoted to Mom's opinions on Henry James. And if you read the full 26 pages, the James section stands out. It is clearly the anomaly with everything else. I mean, he gets the most attention by far. There's something there. And I remember reading it and thinking how unnecessary 80% of it was. And in fact, the parts that he decided to keep in were just plain cruel. And I would like to actually read you those paragraphs. They are sizable paragraphs. I don't know how long this will take. Mom's a very good writer. He's very engaging. So I don't think this will, take too much. I might interject here and there to give a little bit of context, but I think this is worth listening to just to think about how cruelty operates. And especially when you think about how cruelty is so good at masking itself as something more noble, speaking out for the common good, when in fact it's not that at all. It's just a person being incredibly small and downright embarrassing. So I would like to read to you the section on Henry James by Mr. Somerset Maugham. It's the biography of Ted Morgan that you probably see at every used bookstore in America. And here we go. Now I wish to speak of Henry James. Greatness is a quality which is loosely ascribed to writers, and it is well to be cautious in one's use of the word. But I think no one will quarrel with me when I say that Henry James is the most distinguished literary figure that America has produced. Okay, so far so good, Mr. Maugham. He was a voluminous writer of short stories. Though he lived so long in England, and indeed in the end was naturalized, he remained an American to the last. I cannot feel that he ever knew the English as an Englishman instinctively knows them, and for that reason I have chosen for this book an American rather than an English story. The characters ring more true to life. his English people are more Jamesian than English, and that's the first paragraph. I no longer have the table of contents, so I don't know what story he selected. If anybody knows, please put it in the comments. Paragraph 2. It is impossible, I imagine, for anyone who knew Henry James in the flesh to read his stories dispassionately. He got the sound of his voice into every line he wrote. And you accept the convoluted style of his later work, his long-windedness and his mannerisms, because they are part and parcel of the charm, benignity, and amusing pomposity of the man you remember. Now, I want you to stay with me, because he provides two concrete anecdotes that I want you to listen for. He has a little bit of, I guess, prefatory material. Stick with it. It's all part of the experience. He was, if not a great, a remarkable man. So the reader will perhaps forgive me if in what follows I do not confine myself precisely to the consideration of his stories, which in this introduction is my only concern. Now that's very telling. Okay, what's your motive here, Mr. Maugham? What is the agenda? The number of persons who knew him is growing smaller year by year. I think Maugham's writing in the mid-century, maybe the 1940s, 1950s, long after James has passed. Those who knew him growing smaller year by year, and such recollections of him as they have must be worth preservation. I do not foresee that I shall ever have a more suitable occasion than this to put my own on record. So he's using his introduction to talk about literature, stories spanning, the United States and England, to talk about, well, you're going to see what he talks about. I knew Henry James for many years, but I was never more than an acquaintance of his. I am not sure that he was fortunate in his friends. They were disposed to be possessive, and they regarded one another's claim to be in the inner circle of his confidence with no conspicuous amiability. Like a dog with a bone, each was inclined to growl when another showed an inclination to dispute his exclusive rights to the precious object of his admiration. The reverence with which they treated him was of no great service to him. They seemed to me, indeed, sometimes a trifle silly. They whispered to one another with delighted giggles that Henry James privately stated that the article in the Ambassador, the nature of which he had left in polite obscurity, and on whose manufacture the fortune of the widow Newsom was founded, was in fact a chamber pot. I did not find this so amusing as they did, but I must admit I was often doubtful of the quality of Henry James's humor. Okay, full confession, I would have to look up what the heck he's talking about there. A magazine called The Ambassador. Of course, James had a novel called The Ambassadors. But let's continue. When someone transplants himself from his own country to another, he is more likely to assimilate the defects of its inhabitants than their virtues. The England in which Henry James lived was excessively class conscious. And I think it is to this that must be ascribed the somewhat disconcerting attitude that he adopted in his writings to those who were so unfortunate as to be of humble origin. The somewhat disconcerting attitude that he adopted in his writings to those who were so unfortunate as to be of humble origin. Well, I'll just give you one example that we've covered on this channel, Brooksmith. Okay, you can watch that video. One of the few stories he wrote about someone from the working class, and it is incredibly sympathetic to that character. Unless he were an artist, by choice a writer, it seemed to him more than a little ridiculous that anyone should be under the necessity of earning his living. Come on. The death of a member of the lower classes could be trusted to give him a good chuckle. I think his attitude was emphasized by the fact that, himself of exalted lineage, he could not have dwelt long in England without becoming aware that to the English, one American was very like another. He saw compatriots, on the strength of a fortune acquired in Michigan or Ohio, received with as great cordiality as though they belonged to the eminent families of Boston and New York. I repeat, stay with me. He's almost to his 2 meetings he had with James. But again, this is build up. This sets the stage, so it's important. I guess you can see the teacher part of myself with all my students who had small attention spans. Always apologizing. Okay, and in self-defense somewhat exaggerated his native fastidiousness in social relations. I think it should be added that perhaps in England his more intimate associations were with persons who were not, to use the vulgar phrase, out of the top drawer, but out of a drawer just below. Their own position was not so secure that they could ignore it. So here Mom is showing a little bit of disconcerting attitude towards certain people, maybe of not top shelf quality. Okay, here we go. The meat and potatoes of this video. 2 of my meetings with Henry James stand out in my memory. One was in London at a performance of a Russian play by the Stage Society. I think it must have been The Cherry Orchard, but after so many years I cannot be certain. It was very badly acted. I found myself sitting with Henry James and Mrs. Clifford, the widow of a celebrated mathematician, and herself a well-known novelist. I don't know if that's an alias or what, because I can't think of well-known novelists with the last name Clifford. And we could none of us make head or tail of it, meaning the bad acting of the play. The intervals were long, and there was ample opportunity for conversation. The play disconcerted Henry James, and he set out to explain to us how antagonistic to his French sympathies was this Russian incoherence. Lumbering through his tortuous phrases, he hesitated now and again in search of the exact word to express his dismay. But Mrs. Clifford had a quick and agile mind. She knew the word he was looking for, and every time he paused, immediately supplied it. But this was the last thing he wanted. He was too well-mannered to protest, but an almost imperceptible expression on his face betrayed his irritation, and obstinately refusing the word she offered, he laboriously sought another. The climax came when they began to discuss the actress who was playing the leading part. Henry James wanted to know what class she belonged, and both Mrs. Clifford and I knew exactly what in plain terms he wished to say. But that he thought would be tasteless, and so he wrapped up his meaning in an increasingly embarrassed flow of circumlocution, till at last Mrs. Clifford could bear it no longer and blurted out, "Do you mean, is she a lady?" A look of real suffering crossed his face. Put so, the question had a vulgarity that outraged him. He pretended not to hear. He made a little gesture of desperation and said, "Is she, at last, what you'd call, if you were asked point blank, if you were put with your back to the wall, is she a femme du monde?" Right? a woman of the world, a sophisticated, worldly woman. I don't doubt that this portrayal of that account is accurate. It sounds incredibly accurate. That's how James spoke. He did these long wind-ups, but that was part of the charm. And he had a stutter. He was a slow speaker. I guess that was good for his typist. So that's one minor incident. Doesn't paint him in a very good light at all. Paints him kind of slow-witted, petty, unpleasant company. It's the second one that I want you to listen to most carefully, and I see we're at about 15 minutes or so. The second occasion I remember is when Henry James, his brother William, having recently died, was staying at Cambridge, Massachusetts with his sister-in-law. I happened to be in Boston, and Mrs. James asked me to dinner. There were but the three of us. I can remember nothing of the conversation at table, but it seemed to me that Henry James was troubled in spirit. That's putting it lightly. 1910 was the worst year of James's life. If you read his notebooks, it is so sad to see how he's reduced to basically just writing a bunch of X's. Red X's, black X's, day after day. Leon Adele thinks that those X's were ways of comfort to stand in for the pain of writing. I don't know. But when you see it on the page, it's a person who is, I guess, more than just troubled in spirit. He lost his beloved older brother, and he was having a full-blown crisis, full-blown depression. And now he's going to have dinner with, Mom, who certainly likes to get catty, to put it lightly. After dinner, the widow left us alone in the dining room, and he told me that he had promised his brother to stay at Cambridge for, I think, 6 months after his death, so that if he found himself able to make a communication from beyond the grave, there would be 2 sympathetic witnesses on the spot ready to receive it. Yes, this is true. They did seances with some regularity back in the day. And with William James's renowned research on psychology, psychical research, that's not so out of the question. I know it sounds batty, but it's true. I could not but reflect that Henry James was in such a state of nervousness that it would be difficult to place implicit confidence in any report he might make. His sensibility was so exasperated that he was capable of imagining anything. But hitherto no message had come, and the 6 months were drawing to their end. One message did come, but James Henry quickly called it out as a fraud. It was poorly written. It was clearly not his brother. They had been duped. Last paragraph. Second to last paragraph. When it was time for me to go, Henry James insisted on accompanying me to the corner where I could take the streetcar back to Boston. I protested that I was perfectly capable of getting there by myself, but he would not hear of it. This not only on account of the kindness and the great courtesy that were natural to him, but also because America seemed to him a strange and terrifying labyrinth in which, without his guidance, I was bound to get hopelessly lost. When we were on the way by ourselves, he told me what his good manners had prevented him from saying before Mrs. James, that he was counting the days that must elapse before, having fulfilled his promise, he could sail for the blessed shores of England. He yearned for it. There in Cambridge, he felt himself forlorn. He was determined never again to set foot on the bewildering and unknown country that America was to him. It was then that he uttered the phrase, which seemed to me so fantastic that I have always remembered it. And this is a doozy. James said, "I wander," W-A-N-D-E-R, "about those great empty streets of Boston," he said, "and I never see a living creature. I could not be more alone in the Sahara." End quote. The streetcar hove in sight, and Henry James was seized with agitation. He began waving frantically when it was still a quarter of a mile away. He was afraid it wouldn't stop, and he besought me to jump on with the greatest agility of which I was capable, for it would not pause for a moment than an instant, and if I were not very careful, I might be dragged along, and if not killed, at least mangled and dismembered. I assured him that I was quite accustomed to getting on streetcars. Not American streetcars, he told me. They were of a savagery, an inhumanity, a ruthlessness beyond any conception. I was so infected by his anxiety that when the car pulled up and I leapt on, I had almost the sensation that I had a miraculous escape from a fearful death. I saw him standing on his short legs in the middle of the road, looking after the car, and I felt that he was trembling still at my narrow shave. And that's the second anecdote, painting James as this hideously paranoid, bitter, unpleasant man. And if he was, during that particularly gloomy dinner, as Adele calls it, he was going through the worst depression of his life, but he still showed Mom this incredible kindness and thoughtfulness. Now for the coup de grace, the final paragraph. When for this book I read, yet once again, the short stories of Henry James, I was troubled by the contrast offered by the triviality of so many of his themes and the elaboration of his treatment. He seems to have had no inkling that his subject might be too slight to justify so intricate a method. This is a fault that lessens one's enjoyment of some of his most famous tales. A world that has gone through the Great War, that has lived through the troubled years that have followed it, can hardly fail to be impatient with events, persons, and subtleties that seem so remote from life. Are you kidding me? I'll continue. Henry James had discernment, a generous heart, and artistic integrity, but he applied his gifts to matters of no great import. He was like a man who should provide himself with all the impedimenta necessary to ascend Mount Everest in order to climb Primrose Hill. Let us not forget that there was a novelist who had to his hand one of the most stupendous subjects that any writer ever had the chance of dealing with: the rise of the United States from the small provincial country that he knew in his youth to the vast and powerful commonwealth that it has become. And he turned his back on it to write about tea parties in Mayfair and country house visits in the home shires. The great novelists, even in seclusion, have lived life passionately. Henry James was content to observe it from a window. But you cannot describe life unless you have partaken of it, nor should your object be different. Can you fantasticate upon it as Balzac and Dickens did, unless you know it first, that is life. Something escapes you unless you have been an actor in the tragicomedy. Henry James was shy of the elementals of human nature. His heart was an organ subject to no serious agitation, and his interests were confined to persons of his own class. He failed of being a very great writer because his experience was inadequate and his sympathies were imperfect. And that's it from Mr. Maugham. That to me, if you are not familiar with James and you are getting this introduction to English and American modern literature, you would read that and you would never in your life pick up a book by Henry James based on what Maugham has assessed here. But I want to offer a counterpoint. When I was in Vancouver last month in July, I browsed their library, excellent stacks, and found a book by Graham Greene of essays. And he has a great essay called The Private Universe of Henry James. And I want to read this part that I highlighted. James has been too often regarded as a novelist of superficial experience, okay, as a painter of social types who was cut off by exile from the deepest roots of experience, as if there was something superior in the Sussex or Shropshire of the localized talent to James's international scene. But James was not in that sense an exile. He could have dispensed with the international scene as easily as he dispensed with all the world of Wall Street finance. For the roots, let me repeat that, for the roots were not in Venice, Paris, London. They were in himself. And that, and this is me talking, is where James is truly the master, the writer of consciousness, of universal consciousness. All right? Did he write about Reconstruction or, jazz music? Not really. The Bostonians, I guess, is a Reconstruction novel. But that's besides the point. All of his stories, as inert as they may seem, are in fact quite alive with themes that persist even today. I mean, I can't even believe that needs to be said. So I found that passage incredibly cruel from Mr. Maugham. I certainly won't pass any judgment on him whatsoever. I just don't know his works and biography enough. But the thumbnail that you see on this video, and I'll wrap up in the next 30 seconds, was a cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mail when he decided to, this is Maugham, disinherit his daughter Liza and adopt his grown male secretary, Searle. I forgot his first name. And there are pictures of the two, and they're, playing cards, in full regalia. And the press had some fun with that. And the cartoon that I have is of Maugham coming out of, I guess, the nursery with his newly adopted child. Hey nurse, he just said Dada, capital D-A-D-A. And Maugham, of course, found all of that incredibly cruel. The press, the treatment, he was not happy with it. And yet when we read in his introduction to modern English and American literature, examples of cruelty that are tenfold to what we see the gently ribbing cartoons of the day. Have a good night.